the Warrior, USS Warrior. Just blasting native people on a raft in the middle of the Mississippi River. Heard you're in goal tonight. Excited or what? I was happy when I heard that because I'm going to the game and I'd rather you were playing goalie because I don't have any of the other goalies in class. I don't think. I guess Steve told me you guys have 4 goalies and I was like, I can't name any except for him. So. Woody's still here, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Steven, can't hear me, he's got his headphones in. But I'm worried because yesterday he was going Tampa Bay Rays hat. I'm talking about you. Yesterday you're going Rays hat on Monday. Today you got the White Sox hat on. What are you really about?
I'm a Yankees fan.
Oh.
That's right.
Bet that went well. Start chanting Yankees suck, but that might be over the top, and I'm already like, the Red Sox are going to get swept by the Rays, but I don't care because they ended the Yankees season, and that's all you can ask for as a baseball fan. Is that going?
Yeah.
All right, cool. I'm going to get started in the hopes that we'll finish, but first things first, I am going to give you a note-taking sheet today. You could do the War of 1812, which we're going to look at that through the lens of Blackhawk and the Sauk of Iowa, which are indigenous people that we haven't really talked about a lot. But I think by looking at them, we'll be able to have a really good understanding and idea of maybe how this conflict's a little bit different than we've thought about it in the past. Do any of you know anything about the War of 1812? This is a war a lot of people don't talk about. Yes.
I wrote my HCA on.
Well, sure. So like you got a little bit of, before that, like in your initial thoughts section, is that like a thing you would delve into a lot?
Yeah, I definitely didn't know anything about it, not a lot.
I even think like as a historian, like during my training, it's like a thing no one ever really talked about outside of like the huge bullet points of like the British burned down the White House. And like when I was a kid, we had this weird set of cassette tapes that were like this, I don't even know how to describe it, like a weird program called Adventures in Odyssey, where like these, it was like a church thing, I don't know. But like these kids would like go into the past on these adventures, and one of them they went to the War of 1812 and like saw Francis Scott Key write the national anthem, and like, I don't know, whatever. So that was like my major familiarity with this until I started to study this in more depth. I'm going to give you a note-taking worksheet today. One of the things you could do is obviously look at this and fill it all the way out, and it'll give you a great option for your midterm exam next Wednesday. I'm also going to give it to you and not collect it because that'll give you a blank one on the backside if you chose one of the other topics to maybe organize your thoughts for the midterm. Because as we talked about it the other day, you're basically doing this, right? Except you're writing paragraphs and making your way through that way. Sound good? Make sense? All right, let's kind of get through this as we get going. So when we think about the War of 1812, we're going to put this in this context and check in with one of our native peoples, and that's going to be the Sauk. And we're going to look at this through a couple of different lenses, one being through Blackhawk. And we're going to use 2 different sources in the same way that you do on most of your HTAs to look at this. One being a primary source, which is this book that was dictated by Blackhawk after what's commonly called the Black Hawk War. He's going to sit down with a kind of translator, writer person, and tell the story of his life, tell the story of the War of 1812, and tell the story of kind of his resistance to the American government in this primary source. We're also going to take a look at Carrie Trask's wonderful book on Black Hawk that does a really good job of kind of introducing and talking about different perspectives. And Black Hawk, or as the phonetic spelling we have up there, I'm going to call him Black Hawk throughout the day. Makete Meishi Kia Kiak would probably be how you do that. I'm not great at Algonquin-based languages. Is going to be a Sauk leader during the early 1800s. I would argue that he's one of the most significant people in the history of the state of Iowa. And as he is born into the kind of Sauk tribe, a lot of things are happening for his people. The Sauk are traditionally believed to be from kind of the northern Illinois, Michigan part of the country. But by the time Americans kind of enter this space and Europeans enter this space, the Sauk and Meskwaki have been pushed further west to the Mississippi River Valley. They're an agricultural people. They grow corn, squash, and beans in large fields. They're going to have constructed society that's going to be based on consensus. They're going to have to drive decisions for the tribe through convincing other people. And this is one of the things that Black Hawk has kind of dual roles within this tribe. One, he's going to be a hereditary bundle holder. And we're not going to really get too deep into this today, but this is an important cultural, social role that we could maybe equivocate to like a religious kind of role. These bundle holders are going to hold the history of their people. The Sauk don't have a written language, so like they're not going to record their history that way. But one of the things that they're going to do is associate their history with different powerful objects that are handed down from one generation to the next, usually through hereditary lines. So Black Hawk's father had been a bundle holder. According to him, at least this bundle could be traced back at least 8 generations and represented a significant part of their history. So he has that kind of role. He's not going to function as a hereditary civil chief, though, which many bundle holders would. These are going to be other people that are going to be powerful tribal members that are going to make a lot of the kind of day-to-day decisions within the tribe. We're also going to see leaders within the Sauk be military leaders. And he is going to function in this role. This is more of a merit-based role. If you're really successful in raiding and in battles across the early part of your life, you're going to have the opportunity to eventually rise and have people respect you in the same way that I think like athletics in our society provides kind of this meritocracy. If you're really that good, you're ultimately going to achieve higher levels by like merit of your skill set. That's one of the ways we could maybe look at this. But he's going to be an important person that has a role both inside and outside the tribe. But one of the things I want us to understand is that the Sauk are going to really base things on consensus. So if he decides he wants to go to war, whether it be with their traditional enemies like the Potawatomis or the Dakota or any of the other tribes in the region that they're not aligned with, or if he wants to fight the Americans, what he has to do, essentially, in a really simplified way, is he has to tell people that he's decided to go to war, set up a new lodge outside of the village, and go into a period of like fasting where he's trying to force a vision. And he's going to have a vision eventually and then decide based on that vision if he should actually pursue going to war. And then he's going to wait for, if he has a favorable vision that says they'll be successful when they go to battle, he's going to try to recruit other people to come out to this lodge and join this effort. So everybody kind of has their own say over if they want to go fight with Black Hawk, let's say, against the Dakota. Does that make sense? It's not a major point, but I think it's important to realize that these people controlled their own destinies and they had like radical consensus in their political structure. So during the War of 1812, he's going to fight with the British, where we can see some of this adaptation we've been talking about. The British are going to be treating these native peoples as largely as equals during this time period, where the Americans are treating them as subservient. And so we're post-American Revolution, and during the early Republic, one of the things that's a huge challenge for the Americans, that we talked about the other day, is they're having all sorts of problems along the frontier that are leading them to fight against some of these native peoples. he's going to, in 1804, begin resisting the American government, and he's going to be about 45 years old by that time. He's going to be born allegedly at the kind of on the Rock River at Socanock, which I don't have my pointer, but would be about here in the Quad Cities today. If you've ever been to like Rock Island, Illinois, that's the site of this village where he was born. They have large fenced agricultural fields. He's going to spend his early years there. And one of the most important things is this is where they've been burying their dead for a very long time. Creates an important cultural significance that I think is really important to us thinking about them. And so we can see him talking about this. And actually, this is going to be Trask at the beginning quoting this book, but whatever, we're kind of at inception level there. He's going to go, pondering all that took place at Socanock, Black Hawk confessed to, quote, "When I call to mind the scenes of my youth and those of later days and reflect that the theater on which these were acted had been so long the home of my fathers who now slept on the hills around it, I could not bring my mind to consent to leave this country for any earthly consideration," end quote. In saying that, the old man gave voice to a deep and powerful sense of place and belonging he shared with the other members of the tribal community. For it was there, at Socanock, where everything in their world and their way of life seemed tied together. Not only was it the abode of the living and the dead, it was where the cycles of life began and ended and then began again in harmony with the unending rhythms of nature. Therefore, Socanock was much more than a mere congregation of dwellings and people, infinitely more than a mere matter of land and location. To the Sauk, it was a place of powerful spiritual dimensions. The town and surrounding territories where they had hunted, grew corn, grazed horses, and dug galena from the earth contained all the primal and essential elements of personal and collective identity, which linked them to their past and made the place the sacred center of their world. And Socanock is going to be on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River. And in 1804, the American government is going to try to gain control. You can't really see it, but there's a shaded portion that the Sauk and Meskwaki are going to allegedly cede to the American government in 1804. So we've talked about treaties a little bit as we talked about Inkpaduta really early in the course. But one of the things that I think is important for us to understand is the American government had made a decision that they were going to move the Sauk and Meskwaki west of the Mississippi River. Now they needed somebody to consent to that. And how they did this is very crooked. The idea that an American military expedition is going to be coming down the river and they're going to capture several members of the tribe and bring them to St. Louis and put them in jail in order to get other leaders from the tribe to come down the river to try to kind of like ransom these people back. Literally a hostage situation, I think, if we look at it from an empathy and moral judgment standpoint. And Blackhawk's going to talk about how he learned that they had given away this ancestral place that's supposed to be so important to them. Quash Kwame is going to be the person that's going to conduct this treaty with the government. And here's him talking about how he learned about this. He's going to say, Quash Kwame and party remained a long time absent. They at length returned and encamped a short distance below the village, but they did not come up that day, nor any person approach their camp. They appeared to be dressed in fine coats and had medals. From these circumstances, we were in hopes that they had brought good news. Early in the morning, the council lodge was crowded. Quash Kwame and party came up and gave us the following account of their mission to St. Louis. To quote, on our arrival at St. Louis, they met their American father and explained to him their business and urged the release of their friends. The American chief told him that he wanted land, and they had agreed to give him some on the west side of the Mississippi and some on the Illinois side opposite the Jefferson River. When all the business was all arranged, and they expected to have their friend released to come home with them. But about that time, they were ready to start home. Their friend was let out of prison. He ran a short distance and was shot dead by the Americans. This is all they could recollect of what had been done and said. They had been drunk the greater part of the time they were in St. Louis. And this is a pretty common approach during this time period, that we have this physical coercion happening where they've captured a member of the tribe. But then also, as these people arrive to make these negotiations, the Americans are going to, for lack of a better term, get them absolutely shit-canned. Just drunker than a skunk. And this is going to be like a common negotiating practice. Like during this same year in 1804, Zebulon Pike is going to be another military official for the United States. It's going to go north from St. Louis all the way up into the Twin Cities area. And he's going to conduct the first treaty with the Dakota during this time period. And he's going to bargain for 110,000 acres of land for $45 or so. And he, when he writes in his own notes about how they got ready to make this dealing with the Dakota, the first thing he writes down in his journal, he goes, "We opened their throats and minds with liquor and then proceeded to make the treaty." And so, like, I don't know about you, but I know none of you ever drink, but the idea that, like, maybe you don't make the best decisions. I know I don't sometimes. Also, the idea that, like, they're taking kind of these minor leaders of these tribes and making these deals with them under kind of shady circumstances is going to lead many of these tribal peoples to just ignore these treaties. Blackhawk says, well, Quashkame didn't have this doesn't have the actual support of the tribe. He doesn't have the ability to sign away all these lands. We're not going to respect this treaty. We're going to see other treaties happen in 1825 and 1830 that are going to further impact this, but we're not quite there yet. And so after this, we're going to see him Blackhawk start to oppose the Americans as they move their power into this region. So we think about American power during this time period. One of the things that we kind of take for granted is that we have different we know what the borders of Iowa look like today. So if we start with St. Louis down here, right? We have St. Louis, we have the river go up, we have the nose come out, and then we go up into, and like if we put an arrow, we can say to Fort Snelling eventually, which is going to be in the Twin Cities today. If we need Socanock on our map, it's going to be about right here, Blackhawk's ancestral home. If we start to think about Iowa, we know kind of what Iowa looks like today. Well, we need the Missouri River branching out and giving us our western border, or at least most of it, and heading into the Dakotas. If we think about Iowa, one of the things we have a little foot, and this goes up, creates the Des Moines River, which splits about here. We need, if we go and create our southern border as it exists today, but during the time period, it goes here. If we think about the northern border, it's going to go about here, and kind of looks like Iowa. One of the things that I think is important for us to understand is the Sauk are using Iowa for a variety of different things. It wasn't uncommon for them to cross over into this area west of the Mississippi River. In fact, if we look at how they live their life on a year-to-year basis, one of the things they're doing is they're going to spend the summer months growing their fields at Socanock and growing corn and beans, which is going to give them a stable food source through the winter. And then they're going to come into Iowa, and the tribe's going to fragment into smaller groups along different rivers so that they're not overtaxing local game populations or overhunting like the deer and elk and buffalo that live in Iowa during this time period. And so as they do this, they're going to be splitting onto all the different watersheds in eastern Iowa. So if we think about this, we have like the Wapsie, we have the Turkey, we have if we want to like get us on the map here, we can take the Cedar River and follow it up, and then that's going to split a couple of different ways, one of which is the Winnebago, which we're on right here. So here's where we are if you just want that for reference. If we think about down in southern Iowa, we're going to have the North and South Skunk River. We're also going to have the Iowa River running up through here. And so like the Sauk are very familiar with what Iowa looks like during this time period. They're ranging on all of these different rivers. They're spending a lot of time within the state. And they're going to be here during the winter months of the year. There are also other rivers. If we were to take the Big Sioux, Little Sioux, Mission of Botna, and the Boyer, and then we have the Raccoon River splitting off of the Des Moines probably about there and giving us some of the other watershed. So like this is, not fairly to scale hydrological map of the state of Iowa, but as the Americans start to kind of confront Iowa, they're going to use these rivers as a guide for how they're going to try to project power. It's easy for us in 2021 to think about like, there's no roads, there's no railroad tracks, and rivers are the easiest way to get anywhere during this time period, whether it's on a steamboat or whether it's in a canoe. And so the United States is going to start to build a series of military forts, specifically to push these people through this region. The first they're going to build is on the Iowa side of the river, and it's going to be called Fort Madison. This is still a town today. This is going to be built shortly after the 1804 treaty. And Fort Madison is going to, from the very beginning, face fierce opposition. And this is where we can see Black Hawk deciding that he doesn't respect American power through the region. He's been allied with the British for most of his life, and he's going to ally with them once we get to the War of 1812. And what he's going to do during this early time period is he starts raiding against Fort Madison, this early military installation. The Americans' next closest military fort is all the way up here at Prairie du Chien, and that's going to be Fort Crawford. And there's no other real American military presence in the region. And Black Hawk is going to essentially just lay siege to the small American fort on the Mississippi River. So anytime the people inside the fort need to leave to do anything, whether it's to go gather firewood, whether it's to go hunting to provide themselves with food, the Sauk are just around the fort and prevent that from happening by shooting at the people, harassing them in different ways. And ultimately, they're going to eventually put this surprise attack on the fort that's going to lead them, the Americans, to abandoning the fort and burning it to the ground. So all of a sudden, there's no more Fort Madison here. And this was largely unsuccessful during this time period. So as we kind of get towards the War of 1812, Black Hawk's seen that not only can he fight against the Americans, he can watch them build a fort, and he can push them back out of this region. He's seeing that his power is superior, and that with his British allies, he has plenty of access to guns and other resources. And one of the things that we can't undervalue is that these native peoples knew that their relationship with the British was more adaptative than acculturative. The idea that Black Hawk saw this as an opportunity for his people to remain in power, where he knew with the Americans, their power was going to be somewhat kind of lessened. And by the time we get to the War of 1812, the British are going to view these native allies they can pull throughout the continent as one of their best weapons against the Americans. War of 1812 is going to come along for several reasons. First is going to be that we just have a lot of tensions globally with the British Empire. They're fighting a war against Napoleon on the continent in France in 1812. They have all sorts of commercial interests throughout the American Great Lakes region. And the United States is also struggling. One of the huge conflicts that's developing is happening off the coast of Maine, where there's huge commercial fishing assets. You can go there and catch all sorts of fish that are good on markets, both in Europe and in the Americas. And so all sorts of boats are leaving Boston to go up and capitalize on this natural resource. And the British are also sending boats out of their colonies in Canada to also capitalize on this resource. And this is going to lead to some tensions, especially as the British start to impress American fishermen. They're going to essentially stop these American fishing vessels. They're going to take the men that are working them and put them in the British Royal Navy. You can see where the Americans might have a problem with that. This is what's most commonly cited as the impetus for the War of 1812. Between this and also the British are accelerating frontier tensions. This is a major concern. The idea that the British are helping people like Black Hawk to fight American settlement in places like Iowa and Illinois is going to add to these tensions as well, where eventually the Americans are going to declare war and say, like, you need to quit harassing us, whether it be in these waters off Nova Scotia and Maine, or you need to quit antagonizing native peoples in the center of the continent to oppose us. And as this happens, the British are going to come into the war, and their strategy, especially in 1812, is going to be largely built around two things. First, they have a very powerful navy, the most powerful navy in the world, and they're going to try to blockade the eastern coast of the United States, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's a big piece of this strategy. They can use their advantage. They don't have to shift a bunch of soldiers from this European fight against Napoleon to North America. The other thing they're going to do is recruit people like Black Hawk, and other tribal leaders to fight with them against the Americans all across the frontier. And so as they do this, this strategy really banks on Native peoples helping with this effort. And Black Hawk is going to answer the call. During the war, Black Hawk's going to align with Great Britain in the hopes of pushing the Americans out of this area. He's already seen them lose Fort Madison. The Americans are at Prairie du Chien at the start of the war, at Fort Crawford. But almost immediately, as the war starts, Fort Crawford is going to get taken by the British and their native allies, and it's going to become Fort McKay. And as this happens, the Americans are going to need to try to retake this fort. Black Hawk, as well as many other native leaders from throughout the Midwest, from tribes like the Potawatomi and the Dakota, and even peoples that were traditionally enemies, are going to go up to the UP of what we would think of in Michigan. Anybody ever been to the UP? Fort Michilimackinac is going to be where they all meet, and the British are going to organize their war effort. And one of the things that's allowing the Americans to take Fort Crawford and allow them to have this power is going to be that most of these native peoples have left and gone up to fight in other places throughout the Great Lakes because of this British strategy that relies on natives fighting most of these battles. And so one of the things that's going to happen is while they're gone, the Americans are going to retake Fort McKay. They're going to call it Fort Crawford again. We see it change hands again. And this is going to lead to a little bit of a British change once again. The idea that the British are going to then break out, and they're going to send Black Hawk and the Sauk, as well as other peoples from the area, back to their traditional lands in order to stop the Americans, especially in the Mississippi Valley. So what Black Hawk's going to do is they're going to retake on his way south of this huge kind of Euro-indigenous force. They're going to retake Fort Crawford again. It's going to become Fort McKay again, and it's going to stay Fort McKay through the end of the war. And Black Hawk has a lot to do with that, because after they take Fort McKay, he's going to go back down to the Saukenuk area, and they are just going to absolutely shut the river to American military power. There's going to be 3 different expeditions that are sent north out of St. Louis, one led by future American President Zachary Taylor, as well as one that William Clark is on, of Lewis and Clark fame. And they keep trying to push north out of St. Louis with these American boats. And every time they get to the Quad Cities area, they're going to run smack into this enormous indigenous force. William Clark estimated it at 5,000 men that were holding the river from these different tribes that kept just attacking them and forcing them back down the river. So one of the things that's going to happen is we can really see, I think, in this microcosm, the idea that the Americans have to respect this power that's vested with these indigenous peoples. And also one of the things that it's sending to leaders like Black Hawk is the idea that he can meet the Americans and overwhelm them with force if militarily necessary. So we come out of the War of 1812. Well, I guess we got to see what else happens. What does the War of 1812 end? We're going to see Black Hawk be very successful here, but he's also making a bet that the British are going to win this war. The idea that, like, you ally yourselves one direction or the other, and since their tribe was so built on consensus, there are going to be other leaders who take other paths and have other people follow them. Keokuk's going to be the best example of that. He's a different Sauk leader, and he's actually going to support the Americans, largely by staying out of the conflict and saying, like, well, I think the Americans will ultimately win the war. They're going to be in control of this area later, and if we oppose them now, they're going to be much harder on us than they would be if we don't fight against them. And so Keokuk's going to rise to prominence and create a different voice within the Sauk that's actually going to be the voice the Americans listen to going forward after this. And this is important because in tribes where there's this kind of radical political representation where, like, you can decide who you're going to follow within this structure of tribal leaders, Black Hawk is going to start to be this voice against the Americans, and Keokuk's going to be this advocate for people agreeing to this American acculturation. So the War of 1812 is going to eventually come to an end in kind of a weird way. Following the spring of 1814, during that time period, the British are going to defeat Napoleon in France. This is a huge deal because all of a sudden their army is freed up to come to North America. And they're going to become much more aggressive, particularly on the eastern coast of the United States, in winning this war. And when I mean like they're going to become more aggressive and successful, they're going to literally capture Washington, D.C. and burn the White House to the ground. I feel like that's a W if you're the British. The Americans are going to have several big victories as well late in 1814, most specifically in New York and Baltimore, that are going to lead to the eventual British surrender and the Treaty of Ghent that's going to be signed. We have one last American victory led by Andrew Jackson. This is going to lead Andrew Jackson to national fame. This is only important to us because we're going to spend a week talking about Andrew Jackson here a few weeks from now. But Andrew Jackson gets together like this really interesting group of people. Like he's got a bunch of formerly enslaved people. He's got a bunch of pirates from the Caribbean. He's got a bunch of like different native peoples, and then also like people that have defected from the British Army. And they're going to defeat the British at New Orleans. But it happens like 3 days after the war's actually over. But like they didn't just tweet about like, hey, war's over. You know, like they signed the treaty in Europe. And then like somebody had to get on a boat with that and bring it back across the Atlantic Ocean. So his victory seemed very important while it was happening. And then like everybody's like, well, the war was already over though. Anyway, he's still going to become a big deal. That's one of the reasons why I mentioned this. But as the War of 1812 ends, even though like the Americans were never able to open up the Mississippi again or retake Fort McKay and turn it back into Fort Crawford, they are going to win the war because they win on the East Coast. So one of the things is like there's no huge defeat for the Sauk or Meskwaki or these other indigenous allies of the British. All of a sudden they're just told one day like the fight's over, the British are going to leave, and the British do go back into Canada to their traditional fur trading posts and some of these other places, but largely life looks the same in 1815 as it did in 1811 before this war started. One of the things is we continue to see Sakanak as a major point of importance for the Sauk. We're also going to see Fort McKay is going to go back to being Fort Crawford, and we're going to start to see a series of treaties that are going to be enacted there. One in 1825 and then another in 1830. But much like we saw with Inkpaduta earlier in the semester, Black Hawk has already decided he's all the way out on the Americans. He views it as he's beaten them in military combat. He looks at it as they're not powerful in this region, and he continues to go up and visit the British in Canada, and the British keep telling him that if he gets in another fight with the Americans, they'll probably have his back. In the meantime, people are settling all across Illinois. The American military realizes they need a bigger military presence in the region, and right near Sakanak on an island in the Mississippi River, they're going to build Fort Armstrong, which creates an opportunity to apply pressure on the Sauk and keep an eye on them. They're also going to start pressuring the Sauk to move permanently into Iowa, which some of them are going to do. Keokuk is going to initially have a village in extremely southern Iowa, which is now called Keokuk, although he eventually has moved out of there shortly thereafter. Wapello, who's a Meskwaki chief but closely allied, is going to form a village here. And even we're going to see Black Hawk putting a village on the Des Moines River here at Iowaville, where he is going to live during the winter. And this is on the site of an old Iowa village that had been attacked by the Dakota. But as this conflict ends, we're still going to see Americans reasserting their power, but maybe Black Hawk not necessarily believing in this power the Americans now have. So one of the things that's going to happen is they're going to remove the Sauk and Meskwaki by citing that 1804 treaty that was signed in St. Louis across the Mississippi River. That's going to take a long time because formally telling these tribes they have to move and being able to actually force them to do it is a slow process that requires settlement to underwrite this American power in the region. But by the late 1820s, people are starting to move to Illinois, even the western part of Illinois along the Mississippi River, and this is going to create new tensions. So in 1830 and 1831, and I would actually think pretty much every year from 1812 until then, Black Hawk continues to live life largely as he had, this passive resistance we've talked about. They're just going to go hunt and live in villages in Iowa during the winter months. In the summer, they're going to return to Socanock. They're going to practice all their cultural rituals, including feasting related to their dead being buried there. And they're going to grow corn and other agricultural products in these well-established fields near the Mississippi River. Now, they're not supposed to be there technically, but there's also nobody there to stop them from crossing the river and going into Socanock. What changes is going to be in the 1830s, we're going to start to see American population build in. And so in 1830 and 1831, we can see these tensions starting to rise. Black Hawk's going to lead groups back to Socanock to visit these graves, as well as grow crops. One of the things that's going to happen is, as Americans start to enter this space, they're going to look at Black Hawk and these people's village at Socanock as maybe the best place to settle. They don't have to break all these tough prairie plants and break this prairie soil to create their fields. People have already been working these fields. Might be a great way to get a leg up on settling in this area. And as these people are here, we're going to see a critical moment where Black Hawk returns with about 1,500 people, 1,000 of which are women and children, and they're going to show up, and settlers have moved into the village. And this creates a really tense moment. We're going to see William Clark come up from St. Louis. We're going to see the Illinois territorial governor call out a militia of people living up and down the frontier. And these aren't like the best people. Like a lot of these people, and like especially in historical hindsight, like if you were to go to the Illinois State Archives and start looking through some of the letters related to this incident, and this is a thing I did a couple of summers ago, you can go and like, these are some real, like there's some real racial tension here. Like these people hate native peoples, they're constantly under threat from them, and they view them as like incredibly hostile, which may be fair or unfair. But the people making up this militia and answering the governor of Illinois' call to show up at Socanock are showing up because they're really hoping to kill these native people. Now, William Clark's going to show up. They're going to have a meeting. Black Hawk and these other leaders of the Sauk are going to agree to go back to Iowa. But as they do that, there's not going to be any kind of a battle. And we can see Trask writing about this, where one of the things that he's going to talk about is this militia is really disappointed. And this is going to exacerbate some of these tensions further. And so Trask's going to write, the militia encamped in Socanock for one night and burned down many of the bark lodges. Then before departing, perhaps as a substitute for not getting the opportunity to kill and mutilate live Indians, the militiamen attacked the Sauk dead. They vandalized the great cemetery. The Indians had frequently expressed their reverence for the bones of their ancestors and repeatedly declared their reluctance to abandon those sacred remains was their primary reason for not leaving Socanock. The men in the militia undoubtedly knew that. Certainly their leaders did, and what appears to have been a deliberate attempt to inflict the most insulting affront they could imagine on the Sauk, the Illinois volunteers desecrated the graves, digging up and mutilating some of the most recently buried bodies. One of the volunteers had left for home. Felix St. Vrain and Antoine Leclerc went over to the village, and there St. Vrain later reported to William Clark he was astonished to find, to quote, about 15 or 20 graves had been opened, and one entire corpse was taken from the grave and put into the fire and burned. But the damage done by the militia was not confined to the Sauk settlement alone. The amateur soldiers also tore down fences and burned the rails for firewood. They turned their horses loose to grain in the grain fields of the Sauk. There were 1,500 horses belonging to the militia, along with horses they stole from the Sauk. And the morning after the meeting, the sound of the steamboat startled them. They broke into a stampede. He means the horses, that's imprecise writing, but running all together in a confused mass away from the river for miles. And by the time they were rounded up, they had destroyed most of the crops planted by the Sauk. Spencer said he had 20 acres of corn and potatoes, and all were lost. The soldiers complained, the soldiers doing 10 times more damage than the natives ever had, he complained. And this is a settler saying that. The militia volunteers were a rough bunch of undisciplined men, and that was precisely why they had such a decisive impact on the situation with the Sauk. Originally, Black Hawk had said he intended to resist passively and that his people would also remain peacefully in their lodges until physically removed by the soldiers. But later, when asked why he had not carried through on that plan, he replied, "If General Gaines had come with only the regular troops at the island, I should have remained in my wigwam, but to have done so with men of the militia and the officers, having no control of them, would have been sure death to me and my people." Black Hawk confirmed further, saying, "Afraid of the multitude of pale faces who were on horseback, as they were under no restraint of their chiefs." And as this happens, I think we reach a critical tipping point where, I don't know, the idea that you're digging up this entire grave site and killing these people are going to lead Black Hawk down a different path where he's going to try to rally support against the Americans. That winter, he's going to go up to the British holdings in Canada and he's going to ask them for their support in attacking the Americans. And the British traders at Fort Michilimackinac are going to tell him, "We've got your back." They're never going to show up, but he does believe that they're going to. And so in the following spring, he's going to go in April and he's going to lead about 1,500 people across the Mississippi River back to Saukana. One of the things that's going to happen is, as he gets there, he's going to have an initial confrontation, and then he's going to flee into Illinois, going first to White Cloud's village, who is a Ho-Chunk, who they're going to try to ally with. He goes to this village because one of the things he thinks is, if he's going to fight the Americans, these other native peoples should also be interested in overthrowing this American power. And so he thinks that as he makes his way through Illinois and into Wisconsin and ultimately to the Bad Axe River, where he expected a different Ho-Chunk chief to be located, he's going to be picking up more and more people that are going to support his cause and fight the Americans with him. In reality, he's going to catch more and more resistance the further he goes, because as he goes past Fort Armstrong, all of a sudden he has this first military group behind him. We're going to see his band splinter and send out runners to other villages of tribal peoples, which are going to result in some of these other smaller battles or massacres, ultimately leading up to this bigger battle at Stillman's Run that's going to take place on May 14th, about a month after they had originally crossed the river. And as this is happening, the governor of Illinois has called out another militia, which is now putting pressure on them from the east. They have the American military behind them. And as they push north, they're ultimately going to find themselves in a position as they arrive at the Bad Axe late in the summer, 3 months later, where they are in a lot of trouble. This is going to be a months-long kind of campaign that eventually turns into a rapid flight as these desperate people try to get back across the Mississippi River, running from the American military and this territorial militia. And as this happens, they're starving to death. They've run out of supplies. They're running low on ammunition. They don't have the means after the Battle of Wisconsin Heights on July 21st to effectively fight the American military. And when they get to the Bad Axe, one of the things they're really hoping is that one of the closely allied Winnebago or Ho-Chunk chiefs that normally stay there during the summer are there. But they've also been removed west of the Mississippi River. And as they arrive, they meet an incredible force that's going to ultimately destroy them. They arrive at the Bad Axe, and if I don't have my laser pointer because I left it in the other suit, but this idea that look at that location. So we have this territorial militia and this military that's been following them for several months, following them from the east. You have the American military coming up from Fort Crawford, as well as a steamboat named the Warrior on the river that's equipped with heavy artillery that's going to show up at the Bad Axe while they show up there. On the other side of the river, other native peoples are making different choices. And the Dakota, who are traditional enemies of the Sauk, have decided to fight with the Americans against Black Hawk. So as these people are going to start fleeing across the Mississippi River, and I don't know, some of you have probably never been to the Mississippi River. Anybody been there? It's quite wide, right? Yeah, you guys grew up around there, Jalen. Mississippi River, big body of water. Tough to swim across. Never seen anybody try to swim across it. I've canoed and kayaked out there to some of the islands, but these people are desperate. They do have some rafts and some of these other small boats, but ultimately they're going to start to flee across the river. As this happens, They're like just incredibly desperate. And so as this British band, as it's being called at this point, reaches the Bad Axe in the Mississippi, we're gonna see hundreds of people die as they try to swim across the river. Black Hawk is actually going to go with some of the other leaders, and they're gonna cross the river during the night prior to this battle happening. And he flees across the river into Iowa to try to start drawing support from the other parts of the Sauk tribe in the area. And he's going to actually end up here at Black Hawk Point, where he's going to ultimately surrender. If we go all the way back, we have an American depiction of this that's painted after the battle, and here we see the steamboat warrior. We have Bad Axe Creek right there, and we have these people crossing the river, being shot on this giant raft and falling in. I can't tell you, like, it had to just be an absolute bloodbath from all accounts, whether they be Dakota or Sauk or American. I've read most everything that's been recorded related to this or heard elders of both of these tribes talk about it. And it just had to be one of the most like horrifying moments in our state's history. Hundreds of people are going to die. And as Black Hawk gets cornered, he's going to actually be cornered at the foot of this weird kind of rock face that's called Black Hawk Point today. If you were to go over here, this is, you can see the Mississippi River's in the distance. We have these two bluffs that are on either side. And they're going to come across this, and at the foot of this hill, the Dakota are going to hold the high ground, and we're going to see them be pursued, and Black Hawk's ultimately going to give himself up at the foot of this hill. They were kind of hoping, at least in my mind, and like I went out here, would have been about a summer ago. This is 4 miles south of New Albin, and this isn't like a state park or anything. Like, you know, like you go out to Pilot Knob and there's like trails. Like this is just a huge rock face that stretches up like 150 feet. And then behind it is just like incredibly steep sides that are really heavily wooded. Like it took me like an hour and a half to just climb up it by like grabbing one tree and then the next tree and then the next tree, like to keep my footing and leverage and going all the way up the hill. Also got a bunch of like wood ticks that day. But I ultimately found myself at this point overlooking, and this picture's shitty because of the like resolution. But you get this perspective of they were hoping to make it here, climb to the top of this ridge, and then you can actually make it kind of into the interior of the state of Iowa, where he was hoping to find help from some of their other allied tribes or other parts of the South. Well, what's actually going to happen is he's going to surrender. He's going to be captured by 3 people, all of them significant in either Iowa or American history. Joseph Street is going to become the most important person for the Sauk and Meskwaki in Iowa going forward. He's going to be the Indian agent that's going to help them transition further west into Iowa, first at Iowaville, and then later at Agency as they're moved there, which is actually where Chief Wapello, he's going to get moved to Agency, and him and Joseph Street are become such good friends that when Wapello dies, he requests that Joseph Street gets buried beside him. And if you go there today to Chief Wapello's Memorial Park, you will see Wapello's grave and Joseph Street's grave. These other 2 people, Zachary Taylor eventually becomes president of the United States. That's a historical significance. Jefferson Davis becomes president of the Confederate States of America when those states secede from the United States to start the American Civil War. So like these are people that are pretty significant. And as they capture Black Hawk, they're going to bring him into custody, and they're going to take him to Prairie du Chien, where you can see this window today. This was the window of his jail cell at Fort Crawford at Prairie du Chien. And if you go, I don't know why, I took this picture like 7 or 8 years ago, and I'm really stupid, because if I took it the other way, I wanted to get this historical marker about Black Hawk's surrender in the background. But if you flip around and look through it the other way, you can see the Mississippi River. And like it's intentionally placed there because of the powerfulness of that idea of him sitting in that jail cell, looking out at the Mississippi River, which was kind of his people's homeland while he was in prison. He's ultimately going to be transferred to Jefferson Barracks, where it's going to be kind of near St. Louis, and he's going to be held in captivity. And then 8 months later, he's going to be taken on this whirlwind tour of the eastern United States with many other tribal leaders from the Mississippi River watershed in order to impress upon them the power of the American people. So he's going to be taken to places like Philadelphia and Boston and New York City and Washington, D.C., where he's actually going to meet President Andrew Jackson. And this is going to be meant to show them how powerful the American people are and convince them that they need to move onto these reservations and listen to the American plan for them. We're going to actually close, well, we won't. We'll finish this out now because we got 4 minutes. He's going to live in Iowa, primarily on the Des Moines River at Iowaville. And actually, after he's dead, we're going to have an interesting, this is a mystery for you. Nobody knows where his body is now. So Black Hawk's going to die at Iowaville, and he's going to die on October 3, 1838, after falling ill. And he's made friends with this farmer who's going to bury him on his farm and then post people to protect his body because they knew people would be interested. One of the things that like white doctors during this time period really liked to do was like take people like Black Hawk and then like basically strip all the flesh off their skeletons and then put them on display places, which there was somebody that wanted to do that and was actually ultimately successful later. In July of 1839, a little less than a year later, James Turner, who's a local doctor, is going to steal his body, put his skeleton on display, and charge people admission. We're going to see Black Hawk's sons petition the governor of Iowa then, Robert Lucas, to do something about this. So like it's wild that you can steal this person's body from this cemetery, which is now called Iowaville. And it's completely unmarked, which is wild to me. This idea that like he's one of the most significant leaders in the history of our state, and many things are named for him, including like an NHL team and I don't know, millions of other things, including a river, a state park, a hotel in Cedar Falls, and on and on. And this is his original gravesite in this Iowaville cemetery, which like literally I care a lot about this. I've done a lot of research into it, and I walked by it without noticing when I was walking up the Des Moines River because it's completely unmarked. I had to loop back and go up there because he's just not really celebrated in the same way. His body is going to, one of two things happens to his body after it goes to Governor Lucas. Either Lucas donates it to the Burlington Geological and Historical Society, which puts Black Hawk in a box, and then the building burns down later in the 1800s, which would have effectively destroyed his remains. There's another theory about his death that says that Lucas took his body and gave it to another local doctor named Enos Lowe, who left him to his partner in medicine. They had a 2-person doctor's office, and Lowe moves to California. And allegedly, he maybe gave the body to this guy named Dr. McLaurin's. And when McLaurin's later moves also, they find this box full of bones in McLaurin's basement of his house. And people start to say that that's Black Hawk, which is like kind of dubious. But this idea that like they took those bones that were found in the basement of his house and buried them as Black Hawk in the Aspen Grove Cemetery in Burlington today. But like nobody really knows. And I've always thought like that it's really weird that like I think Black Hawk his remains were burned at the fire at the Historical Society, which means then like whose bones are in Dr. McLaurin's basement, like and why are there human bodies being stored in your basement to begin with? But Black Hawk is kind of this powerful kind of, I think, representation of resistance to American power and how that affects public memory. Because people like Wapello or Keokuk, who were much more sympathetic to the Americans, are much better remembered, both in terms of like monuments and other things. Like there's literally a Chief Wapello Memorial Park at Agency where him and Joseph Street are buried, as well as kind of Black Hawk. We see this disconnection. Anyway, that's our time. We'll have our midterm on Wednesday, so make sure you're getting ready for that. Go skate with the Warriors tonight. Let's get a W. And I will see you back here on Monday.